So in the debate of let it be resolved that mandatory minimum sentence rule shall no longer exist in Canada, we are the opposing party. We argue that mandatory minimum sentences should be maintained. Mandatory minimum penalties, also known as mandatory minimum sentences, are legal sentencing levels in which the minimum sentence is specified by law. Mandatory punishment does not always imply mandatory incarceration and may instead include imprisonment, bans, and/or fines. The establishment and enforcement of mandatory minimum sentences are best articulated through Foucault's concept of power.
As explained by Foucault, power is derived from knowledge, which is influenced by societal discourse. Society's discourse determines or categorizes behavior as good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable. The legal status of a behavior, whether it is regarded as crime, is determined not solely by the content of the behavior, but by the social reaction to the behavior or the individuals who engage in it. Social movements are frequently responsible for changes in the legal status of conduct. These discourses can be thought of as systems of knowledge or disciplines that take the shape of disciplinary activities. Discourses are thus productive in the sense that they generate knowledge. In fact, discourses make whatever is known knowable. Importantly, such bodies of knowledge or disciplines are historically formed. Therefore, power for Foucault is not just a negative, coercive, or repressive force that forces us to do things against our will, but it can also be a necessary, constructive, and good force in society. The act of disciplining indicates that the government can instill particular mentalities in citizens regarding social norms and ethical standards. Additionally, Foucault asserts that power exists through society, manifesting itself in many micro situations involving a wide range of issues. The cumulative result of which is a specific power structure. This particular power structure contains a set of laws, guidelines, and principles enshrined in the Criminal Code of Canada and implemented across the penal system, which serves as guidance for judges when making judicial decisions. As the main goal of mandatory sentencing is to ensure that any individual who commits a crime is treated the same and fairly within the Canadian criminal justice system, while additionally maintaining a secure society. Section 718, coupled with mandatory minimum sentences, evidently achieve these objectives. Mandatory minimum penalties, according to Chastor 2018, address the core notions of sentencing, which are stated in this section of the Criminal Code as to secure society and to contribute in combination with crime efforts and to respect the law and the maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society. Mandatory minimum sentences act as a predetermined sentencing floor for judges when determining the length, extent, and severity of the offense. Additionally, Section 718.1 ensures that judges impose sentences that are proportionate to the severity of the offense and the offender's responsibility while exercising their discretion. In connection to Foucault's idea that power is derived from knowledge drawn from societal discourse, mandatory minimum sentences are justifiable as a legislative prerogative because society and parliament deem such behavior extremely hazardous and thus deserving of a strong level of deterrence.
In 1987, there were just 9 mandatory minimum sentence laws in Canada. The Weapons Act of 1995 added more obligatory sanctions to the criminal code, but mandatory minimum sentences thrived even more in the 2000s and 2010s. Despite the increased use of obligatory punishments such as fines, bans, and jail durations, sentencing in Canada remains a high and necessary customized process. The growing tendency towards mandatory minimum sentencing looks to be overly severe on crime, despite the fact that the consequences apply exclusively to serious offenses, which raise the most concern for society's safety and morals. In relation to Foucault's concept of power, the application of mandatory minimum sentences is spurred by societal discourse or the system of knowledge, which deems the crime unacceptable or in violation of societal morals and values. With a succession of occurrences ranging from Queen Victoria's mail being feloniously carted off to the John A. Macdonald Pacific Affair, postal fraud and robbery became a serious felony in the 1890s. As postal companies expanded, so did the number of controversies. Mail was frequently sent out with letters containing private information about the government, and postal bags contained presents, money, or gold. The Pacific Scandal is very notorious in Canadian history because it involved the records and evidence involving John A. Macdonald and Sir George Edson Cartier, which was kept by Sir Hugh Allen. During a business expedition to secure monetary funding for the Canadian Pacific Railway, Sir Hugh Allen's lawyer named John Abbott hired a private investigator to steal the classified letters that Allen had left with Sir Abbott for protection. These letters were exposed to the House of Commons in 1873 and caused a lot of conflict and controversy. A lot of the confidential mail was not only being stolen, but in some cases it was being redirected. These heinous crimes were becoming a threat to the politicians and causing moral panic in the government. After the Pacific Railway scandal was exposed, the government found it in their best interest to implement mandatory minimum sentences as an easy fix to resolve this problem. Mandatory minimum sentences are an important and constructive and positive force that represents society's perceptions and contributes to a just society. As these legislations largely reflect the majority belief of citizens, their implementations are frequently attributed to the result of moral panic. Mandatory minimum sentences are a message to society that certain crimes can cause destruction and harm to our society. And in efforts to control that, mandatory minimum sentencing must be applied. As mandatory minimum sentences can be dated back to colonial times in the late 1800s, it is evident that the government has long responded to public discourse and moral panic with punitive measures and mandatory penalties. The Canadian criminal justice system has always possessed an arrangement when dealing with certain crimes in regard to settling a minimum level of punishment. The act of first or second degree murder has consistently had mandates as a punishable offense since historical times. There were, however, 6 other notable offenses with mandatory minimum sentences. These offenses were firstly, taking part in a fight that concluded with a prize, which equaled 3 months. Secondly, was fraud upon the government, which equaled 1 month. Thirdly, was robbing of postal bags, which equaled 3 years. Fourthly, was stealing post letters, which equaled 3 years. Fifthly, was seizing mail with intentions of robbery, which equaled 5 years. And lastly was the corruption of municipal affairs, which equaled 1 month. These crimes carried these minimum incarceration sentences as they were deemed heinous crimes during that time. These crimes garnered a substantial degree of moral panic, which aided in the creation of minimums.
Although many argue that moral panic is not a true representation of society, and that because the media misrepresents the seriousness of the crisis, the push to modify legislation is also misrepresented. Moral panic and media depictions have the potential to have a positive impact. If society is aware of a scenario or circumstance that has the potential to cause trauma, violence, or harm to any member of society, and there is a mechanism to deter it, that solution should be adopted. The initial formulations of moral panic suggested that such phenomena arise from significant moral disturbances rooted in structural and value changes within society, and that the subjects of panic are not random, but trigger points in such transformations. Panic does not have to be associated with the original incident. Instead, it can be interpreted as a metaphor for modern problems and a symbolic instrument through which a variety of societal worries are articulated and conveyed. Increases in crime generate long-term moral panics over violent crime, and the societal discourse also fuels political discourse and action. In response to the moral panic, which in this case is mandatory minimum penalties, law enforcement officials and legislators aim to gain public favor by toughening up on crimes that sparked the panic in the first place. Mandatory minimum penalties demonstrate the criminal justice system's engagement with communities and commitment to reflecting the larger moral perspective. This is evident through a rise in crime in the late 1800s, which garnered a significant amount of moral panic. Through the rise of mandatory minimum sentences, it's frequently attributed to Canada's conservative federal government's tough on crime policy, claiming that sentences had become too lenient and the rights of accused and convicted individuals came at the expense of victims and law-abiding citizens. The development and support of mandatory minimum sentences really began with the liberal federal government in the 1990s under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien as part of a tougher approach to gun regulation. These tactics were used to build public support by addressing topical concerns in societal debates at the time. The escalation of punishment in reaction to moral panic shows public judgments of the gravity of the threat to social ideal, thereby ensuring that in the event of that moral panic, public trust in the criminal justice system is not lost. The inclusion of mandatory minimum sentencing in Canada can be argued that without any formal guidance on sentencing, Canada would see a wide range in the variety of sentencing. Judges would arrive at a different conclusion or sentence for the same crime based on their individual perception of the offense and any personal biases. In addition, judges would have no knowledge of other cases to relate to because of the absence of any formal policy. A lack of accessible policies or guidelines available for judges to follow while sentencing warrants a variety of sentencing for the same offenses. Conclusively, mandatory minimum sentences allow Canada to have a just system that brings unity to its criminal justice system, effectively broadcasting to society the rights and wrongs. Durkheim expresses this idea through a concept of the government as a social cohesiveness to further illustrate how mandatory minimums are both a reflection of and a responsibility to society. From the perspective of Durkheim, the relationship between the state and society under a democracy is basically dialectical, with neither element ever immersing its own identity in the other. The two are inextricably linked. The vaguely diffused sentiments that float through society affect the decisions made by the state. By expressing this, Durkheim is implying that the state represents important moral principles and is a major binding social component in moral civilizations. Society can also take this position as these moral principles are usually imposed or induced by them. However, it is ultimately up to the state to implement and enforce these shared perspectives. Durkheim believed that specific institutions contribute to a functional society by allowing the system in place to satisfy society's needs. Durkheim argued that a structure and its function should be consistent. According to this theory, the state has a moral obligation to contribute to the normal functioning of society. The state should not be distant or remote, but rather play an active role in promoting a common morality. Above all, the state is a moral agent that focuses on the greater social society's ideals inside itself, providing clarity of focus that the community as a whole cannot provide. According to this position, the state is obligated to continue calling people to a moral way of life. In other words, the state is first and foremost a moral discipline organ. Specific institutions contribute to a functioning society, allowing the system in place to satisfy society's demands. And as argued by Durkheim, a given structure and its function should remain consistent. The specific institution in this situation would be the criminal justice system, and the consistency would be the use of mandatory minimum punishment for the most serious crimes. Similar to the belief of Foucault, Durkheim states that instead of believing that crime has a moral and socially binding role in and of itself, it is wiser to consider that this function as resulting from societal reactions to crime. Crime confirms and reproduces the boundary between good and evil by its societal reactions, and this division is constantly readjusted to new conditions. Although these societal reactions or discourses influence the implementation of state legislation, they also have the ability to overturn them.
Minimum penalties are not concrete, can alter as cultures, norms, and discourse change, and should remain in place for the most severe crimes. Mandatory minimum sentences can be tied together with the ethical theory of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. It is a form of consequentialism. Utilitarianism holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Legislative arguments for mandatory minimum sentences are commonly focused on utilitarian goals. These goals include deterrence, incapacitation, and retribution. These goals are static, however, the means to achieve these goals are dynamic. This expands on Durkheim's theory that crime validates and reproduces the line between good and evil through societal reactions, and that this line is always readjusted to new conditions. This is evident through the implementation or removal of mandatory minimum sentences for certain offenses. For example, the mandatory minimum sentences for the Drug Act changed because it was deemed too harsh. According to Justice Minister David Lametti, the previous drug bill had flaws and had a negative impact on minority groups. The criminal justice system revealed evidence of overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous, especially in terms of drug offenses. The new law states that prosecutors must consider recommending defendants to treatment programs or other support services rather than charging them with simple drug possessions. Mandatory minimum sentences remain for a number of offenses, including murder, high treason, sexual offenses, impaired driving, and some firearm offenses, including firearm offenses connected to a criminal organization. These are offenses that society has judged unacceptable, and society is unwilling to evaluate potential causes that contribute to the crime, as is the case with offenses that do not have a mandatory minimum sentence. If there are no mandatory minimums, severe crimes like murder and rape would be open to judicial discretion when sentencing offenders. Mandatory minimum sentences is important to stay in place when looking at severe crimes such as these. Mandatory minimum sentences for the Drug Act was repealed as there were many underlying factors that contributed to a person committing crimes such as living in a racialized or a low-income community. Seen through a practical viewpoint, the mandatory minimum sentences that are still in place express that repercussions of doing what is right or wrong. The mandatory minimum sentences laws that are still enacted prove that these crimes have higher unethical power as the government's responsibility to represent the needs and wants of society. It is their duty to ensure public safety and a fair justice system. In Bill C-68, mandatory minimums introduce legislation against offenses with firearms. The judicial system must impose at least a 4-year sentence to the defendant if their conviction falls under the accounts. Mandatory minimums are extremely necessary because of the moral panic against gun possessions and all the harms that have been accompanied by them, thus implying that it is the role of the government to control moral panic and instill moral principles. Cohen, 1971, created the notion of moral panic and explained it as the subject of panic is not random but rather trigger points in such transformation, and the effects of panic are in some ways self-fulfilling. Mandatory minimum sentences portray promises for society safety with respect to firearm crimes. An evaluation based on the 1977 introduction of mandatory minimum sentences found that there are a modest decrease in the number of homicides and robberies involving a firearm that took place. A survey that was conducted by Harding 1990 in Western Australia, which sampled armed robbers, found that robbers are very considerate of the threat of punishment and more specifically, the mandatory minimum sentences that will be imposed, whereas all but one of the armed robbers stated that they were aware and intimidated about the consequences of being caught because they understand that the weapon used had a longer maximum penalty in their country. The survey noted that robbers who carried guns were more likely to be aware of the consequences they may face than the robbers who were committing the same act but without a firearm. This proves that individuals who may consider committing a heinous crime with a firearm will be more conscious due to the outcome of having to serve a mandatory minimum sentence.
Mandatory minimum sentences promote consistency in sentencing. When appropriately administered, mandatory minimum sentences are significant tools for ensuring there is justice in sentencing. Judicial discretion in sentencing has never meant an unrestricted right to impose any penalty the court deems fit. Legislation that has been relying on mandatory minimum sentences since the 1890s for mitigating inconsistencies and other essential mechanisms for exercising judicial discretion. A focal point in the Canadian criminal justice system is that it stands on inquiring about old legislation to pass new progressive legislation that must be associated with the applicants of justice. Mandatory sentencing has become more prevalent globally. Governments have introduced mandatory sentencing laws in response to public concerns that some courts have been overly lenient towards crimes or that sentencing results are unpredictable and ambiguous. In response to the community's perception of sentencing not being strict enough, mandatory minimums maintain confidence in sentencing removing unpredictability and justice, and promoting law and order. Canada's government upholds 5 important qualities that their law should reflect. They are certainty, accessibility, intelligibility, clarity, and predictability. If there are gaps within our laws and justice practices, the strength of Canada's criminal justice system would deteriorate and become represented incorrectly, creating ambiguity and irregularity. These minimums are intended to increase sentencing uniformity and result in sentences that are seen as more representative of the community and its standards. Ultimately, mandatory minimums set a stable sentencing range for judges to utilize when imposing sentences and allow disobeying members of society to understand the severity of an offense and the consequences attached. Moreover, not only does mandatory minimum sentencing promote consistency with sentencing, but it also works to minimize systemic racism and biases from influencing judges' sentencing decisions. Considering that the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous communities is already prevalent within the criminal justice system, with mandatory minimums set in place, removing the mandatory minimum sentences would greatly increase the rate of the overrepresentation, including leaving space for judges to be completely biased and stereotypical when imposing sentences. The guidelines of mandatory minimum sentencing allow judges to stay consistent and minimizes the risk of being too harsh on a particular group. Throughout Canadian history, there have been numerous cases of Black or Indigenous individuals forced to serve longer sentences or life with no parole. Mandatory minimums aim to provide equality for each individual and ensures that no matter their skin color, they will be held accountable. According to a study by the United States Sentencing Commission, Black men who commit the same crime as white men are more likely to receive a 20% longer sentence. Racialized individuals also have a lower chance of receiving parole even after eligibility criteria are met. As the utilitarianism theory suggests, criminal penalties moderately benefit society and offset the actual cost of punishment. More specifically, the application of criminal sanctions may deter the offender from executing future crimes and also discourage other civilians from possibly committing future crimes as well. Mandatory minimum sentences not only deter but also incapacitates offenders, according to supporting advocates. In regards to deterrence, mandatory minimum sentences can be viewed as sending a deliberate and consequential message to all criminals. The use of these offenses is a reflection of controlled sentencing and the promotion of parity.
Ultimately, mandatory minimum sentences are a reflection of society's beliefs imposed by the government and employed through the judicial system. The application of these laws is spurred by societal discourse or the system of knowledge which deems the crime unacceptable or in violation of societal morals and values. Minimum sentences contribute to a functional society by allowing the system in place to meet the needs of society. Through societal reactions, crime affirms and reproduces the line between good and evil, and this line is constantly readjusted. As a result, society's moral perspective will determine whether an offense should carry a mandatory minimum punishment or not, whether that means enacting new legislation or repealing an existing one. The use of mandatory minimum sentences is still achieving the objectives within the principles of sentencing. Mandatory minimum sentences deter the offender or others from committing future crimes. As with these minimums being in place, it removes the possibility for the offender or those considering engaging in crime to think they are going to get away with their behavior or that it is an easy offense to commit and beat. These minimums also remove an offender from society to prevent future crimes. In case of serious offenses that carry a mandatory minimum, a sentencing judge has to decide to employ that minimum. That minimum sentence is appealed, and if it is a sentence including incarceration, the offender will be removed from society. Furthermore, mandatory minimum sentences promote a sense of responsibility in offenders and acknowledgement of the harm they have done to the victim and the community, as well as provide reparations for harms done to the victims and the community, as they are either facing or receiving a sentence that reflects the morals and discourse of society. Additionally, despite the presence of mandatory minimum sentences, judges can still tailor the punishment to further the offender's rehabilitation. This is evident through the findings of a study done by Marriott. The study assessing the impact of mandatory minimum sentences reveals that the installation of mandatory minimum sentences sparked system responses that work to minimize some of the negative impacts of the legislation, primarily through the exercise of current increased prosecutorial discretion. Therefore, while ensuring the offenders committing the most heinous crimes that pose the biggest threat to society based on the morals and perspectives of society at that time are receiving sentences proportionate to their actions, there is still discretion being employed and many factors are still being considered during sentencing. Based on the impact that the abolishment of mandatory minimums would have on the rates of incarceration, sentencing lengths have already disproportionately impacted offenders, and the rise in crime that could occur due to leniency on heinous crimes such as sexual assault, murder, carrying a weapon, etc., coupled with the reality that these minimums are in place based on society's perspectives, which the governing body is obliged to reflect and protect. Mandatory minimum sentences should remain in Canada.